Okay, was ancient Egypt fundamentally an agriculturalist and pastoralist society with a high degree of urbanization? John A. Wilson and his civilization without cities might be correct, but so was Irie and the village economy in pharaonic Egypt. There's no reason to separate urbanism from ruralism. In a vast rural concept, we could argue that agriculture requires a specialized form of urbanism designed to produce and process food, store surplus, and use part of it to maintain the system. The same applies to animal husbandry, with specialized places to gather, breed, butcher, and dispose of animals. If we could make an abstraction to categorize the diverse range of definitions for city, particularly the ancient city, there are at least three big groups. From a morphological checklist perspective, a more emic perspective from a functional point of view, or from a cognitive or perceptual perspective, with a cosmological but also materialistic view. Evidently, just like the term city itself, all these definitions cannot be fitted exactly into precise categories. In my case, I am following Manuel Castell's The City and the Grassroots with an object-oriented approach whose roots can be found in psychology and computer programming. Let's start with some basic terminology. This is the complex part. Urban is defined as the social meaning assigned to a spatial form by a historically defined society. An urban form is the symbolic expression of urban meaning and of the historical superimposition of urban meanings and their forms. Urban meaning is defined as the structural performance assigned as a goal to cities in general by the conflicting process between historical actors in a given society. And following these sociological definitions, a city is defined as a particular type of urban form, and so a social product, and like any other social reality, is historical. According to these definitions about urban and city, from an archaeological point of view, to recognize the city or a city, we need to look for the material aspect of the urban form. In this case, what needs to be found is the materiality of the urban functions, or the organizational means where took place an artificial transformation of space aimed to perform the goals assigned to each city by its historically defined urban meaning. Now, with this urban framework, it could be easier and more practical to talk about urbanism in Egypt, which has been described in the past as a society without cities supported by a village economy. In my opinion, researchers have said this because, in general, they were not able to recognize urban forms that they can recognize as and call a city. Hence, the debate has been biased. For Childe, urbanism is an economic change in an evolutionary process preceded by barbarianism. For him, to talk about cities is to talk about civilization. But what does this mean? According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first entry of city defines it as a large town. If we look up town, we observe that it is a built-up area with a name, defined boundaries, and local government that is larger than a village and generally smaller than a city. Most dictionaries lack a precise lexical definition of city or urban because of the nature of both terms, which tend to be ambiguous, historically, culturally, and subjectively defined. Most of the time, the definitions for them are speculative or precise definitions. Let me demonstrate this with an example. Durham City is smaller than Middlesbrough, almost in everything. Yet the latter is not a city. However, from a prototypical modern perspective, perhaps Durham does not even look like a city, although nominally has the city status. Let's look again for city in the same Oxford Dictionary. In entry 1.1, we will find that in the British domain, a town created a city by charter and usually containing a cathedral. In the United Kingdom, there are civic honors that are granted by the Queen or King under the royal prerogative, acting on the advice of ministers to grant a town a city status. After 1888, the link was abolished between a cathedral and the city status. Among other cities, Durham has been recognized and granted the status by ancient prescriptive right, just because the definition of it as a city derives from the day when towns with a cathedral, which involves a seat of a bishop, were denominated as cities. Therefore, urban and city are terms that can be defined historically by dictate or even by perception. A city, then, should be considered an analytical tool rather than a concept that can describe a particular form of human use of space. Instead of categories to define a city, we should talk about the specific types of settlements or specific types of urban forms, which historically result from conflicting social interests and values, both in its materiality and urban meaning. The use and overuse of the word city with an implicit relation to traditional urban concepts encouraged McIntosh and McIntosh to devise appropriate conceptual frameworks for Middle Niger cluster cities, explained in part for the long history of Western difficulties with understanding or even recognizing urbanism in sub-Saharan Africa. McIntosh and McIntosh statements on European colonization are important because they say that in the colonial imagination, talking from the westernized point of view, Africa was predominantly rural in character, and that the walled cities and towns of the Sahel were a colossal surprise to Europeans. Basically, because the cultural and political achievements in the Sahel were attributed to the influence from the north, since urbanism was thought to be not native to Africa. McIntosh and McIntosh talk as if this prejudice about African urban development was eventually buried in the Western thought. However, according to the editor of the book in which they published the paper, Michael Smith, they were trying to see cities where possibly there are none. Likewise, McIntosh and McIntosh fell into this colonization of knowledge when saying that even Yoruba settlements, large, densely populated, nucleated, were not recognized as urban in character, assuming that urban must be defined from these variables. In a less precise but broader sense, urban could refer to any single human creation that allows humans to live permanently settled, and an ancient city, paraphrasing Castells, might be what scholars, through time, decide what it is. In Egypt, there are also struggles to define the physical context of urbanism. The landscape has changed drastically in the last 5,000 years, but certainly the most dramatic transformation has happened relatively recently, when the Low Aswan Dam was built between 1899 and 1902, with a final blow to the river in the 1970s, when the High Aswan Dam started to operate. There are few visual records of the flood in general, and we still do not know what the ancient Egyptian landscape looked like. However, we might get an idea by looking ancient maps and history, geoarchaeology, ancient texts, symbology and geography, toponyms and philology, or a more interdisciplinary approach with an archaeological focus. Also, we could model the flood to have a rough idea about what happened in the Nile Delta during this time and analyze how the water covered land and to what extent. What I proposed is that rather than considering the settlement as the basic unit of analysis to understand Egyptian urban forms, we need to find the relationships among a series of settlements that were in charge of the management of a particular area, which could include the construction, management, and maintenance of canals, dikes, and agricultural land, channel dredging, and eventually building and managing the settlements and their infrastructure. From an object-oriented perspective, this is about finding meronymic relations that could constitute the holonym, Egyptian urban form, particularly the ancient Egyptian city. In an object-oriented approach, the prototypical theory is often used to generate compositions, and probably it is necessary to recall that most concepts are based on cognitive psychology. So rather than pretending to model the world, this approach tries to model the way humans perceive it. That is to say, and just to put a name to the phenomenon, the Egyptian city has to be considered a particular type of urban form, built upon one or many elementary units to express settlement. In this case, there is several words to express settlement in Egyptian terminology. As a social product created by the conflicting processes between historical actors in Egyptian society, An Egyptian city will concentrate the fundamental elements to perpetuate the system. Due to the nature of the Nile Valley and Nile Delta, the Egyptian city could have constituted a single settlement or a constellation of settlements, which symbolically expressed the structural performance assigned as a goal by the historical actors. This urban form had a particular urban culture, and this urban culture that changed primarily because of the historical transformations, and secondarily, but not necessarily less dramatic, due to the acculturation process. The emic approach is, of course, useful, but it could be misleading if our knowledge of an ancient urban union is understood from an ethnic perspective. A good example of this in our time is the city status in the United Kingdom, explained before. But we could also talk about three of the most famous and paradigmatic United States cities, such as New York, Los Angeles, and Washington. All of them are called cities regardless of their shapes, density, compactness, type of landmarks, monuments, public spaces, administrative buildings, which all constitute non-meronymic relations. And archaeologically, this might be a problem. From an emic perspective, the citizens from each city perceive themselves as different from another city to the point of creating some kind of rivalry. They pursue different goals, they act differently, and historically they give a particular social meaning assigned to each particular spatial form. As we can see, the discussion has been led by the morphological aspect of how a city should look, which is a stereotype, and to what extent this morphology resembles our modern perspective, or a modern idea of what a city is or should be. We could try to understand Egyptian society values and maybe try to understand their urban meaning in relation to their own spatial forms. We might be able to model a prototype of their urban form that we might call a city. By exploring this and the effects of acculturation through the following 4,000 years, we might trace urban change. So it is said that Isis ran away to the Nile Delta marshes to hide from Seth to give birth to Horus, whose father was Isis' brother, Osiris. This story implicitly tells us that you might hide in the Delta, in the marshes, but it also might refer to a distant, mythical, or unknown faith in the wider. More critical than hiding is the fact that you could live in the marshes. Most river deltas in the world are water labyrinths, indeed, but habitable places too. Just before the High Aswan Dam construction, the Nile Delta was not the exception, exacerbated by the numerous artificial waterways that they have built in Egypt for thousands of years. The Horus myth gives us another theme. The son of the two gods related to the Valley River Delta, Osiris Isis, versus their enemies, Seth Nephthys, more related to the desert. This relationship is noteworthy considering that the pig cult is associated with Horus and Osiris, but Ra made it abhorrent to Horus according to the Book of the Dead. If we consider that Osiris is the Greek Dionysius who had his own pig cult, the plot thickens because if Horus is a god for Lower Egypt and Seth of Upper Egypt, then the pig becomes more interesting than the falcon. Pigs, hippopotamus, and peccaries belong to the same mammalian order, Artiodactyla, all of which are suiformes. The Eurasian wild pig, Sus scrofa, and the common hippopotamus, Hippopotamus amphibius, were found in Egypt from the Neolithic period until the 19th century. However, there has been some debate about the origin of domestic pigs, Sus scrofa domesticus, and even wild boar in Egypt. Whatever be the case, if the origins of the domestic pig in Egypt are Asiatic, then it would not be coincidental that deltaic sites such as Sais, modern Sahel Hagar, have pig remains from the Neolithic period. As far as human mobility is concerned, due to a non-stationary way of life, the migration of pigs from the eastern to the Nile Delta's western frontiers would be expected and is called the agricultural cultural package. There were pigs in the Nile Delta, but we lack evidence of pigs breeding or, in general, the awareness of the importance of pigs in ancient Egyptian archaeological contexts. The lack of evidence during the 20th century can be explained relatively easily. Firstly, pigs have negative connotations in Islam. This negative connotation has been studied historically, and its origins are traced back in time comparing ancient Egyptian taboos and their Semitic counterparts. Secondly, the market trend during the 19th and 20th centuries to focus on cities, which was very likely on the core or monumental area of a dispersed settlement, and tombs of the Nile Valley. Unfortunately, non-monumental built-up areas and without inscriptions were relegated to a position of little or no significance in antiquarian terms. Technically, the lack of pigs attends similar roots to Wilson's lack of cities in Egypt. It was not a lack of pigs, but a lack of research on areas where pigs are not likely to be found. Now, it has been pointed out that pigs require moist soil and were kept in the Nile Delta from time immemorial. However, when the land was conquered by the Upper Egyptians, the victors regarded these practices with horror. Swine were unclean in their eyes. The prohibition which they proceeded to impose on swine was founded on a divine myth. The myth that Keys refers to appears in the Book of the Dead. From the 18th dynasty, Ra states that the pig would be abominable for Horus' sake, not to the whole country, and it certainly is difficult to assess why the pig should be abominable. In another spell, the presence of a pig-like animal called Ibka is attested. Was the animal's habits or appearance repulsive, or was it more related to cultural or environmental choices? Probably none, or probably both. According to Wilson, the earlier Deltaic culture might have been integrated with a more sedentary agricultural one from Upper Egypt or Northeast Palestine. Then settlements such as Buto and Sais in the Nile Delta created primary trading links that competed with those of the South and the Levant. Animals like pigs or fish from the marshes could have been associated with a hunter-gatherer society, mythologically speaking, a said Nephthys society, which was being replaced by a larger system of organization managing the floodplain and the marshes for agriculture, an Osiris-Isis society, a civilized society. The Osiris-Isis society started to be seen as more prestigious and eventually repulsed pigs or fish, which nonetheless were still consumed by the lower classes. In Amarna, for instance, pig remains are concentrated in the workmen's settlement's pig pens rather than in the core of the settlement. Consequently, despite this idiosyncratic pig segregation, pigs are found everywhere. The case of Buto and Sais is relevant not only because both settlements were occupied continuously for at least 4 millennia since the Buto-Madi period, but also to explain the Hunter-fisherman-pastoralist-gather fluidity in cultural dispersion against the more static agricultural society. This same issue might be considered in other deltaic sites where fishing and pig herding or even hunting of wild boar was possible. The relation to pigs, the marshland habitat, and fish resources could have created a different city in comparison to the Upper Egyptian city, the roots of which might be found before the advent of pharaonic Egypt. On a political level, the Osiris myth and the loss of Horus' eye, which was created after the unification of Egypt took place, could imply a moment of resolution for two different urban societies. A myth from the 18th dynasty was reminiscent of a distant past that not necessarily reflects reality, but reinforced or perhaps explained the idea of urban segregation, which is which and who is who, and where and how and what belongs to whom. Lower Egypt versus Upper Egypt, sedentism versus nomadism, Egypt versus the Levant. In a sense, a dialectical relationship, not to reduce the other, but to integrate it into the Egyptian domain. Then, in reality, Lower Egypt with Upper Egypt, Egypt with the Levant, sedentism with nomadism, urbanism with ruralism. And thank you.